We start here. Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro and his wife are set to make their first appearance in a New York court today. These are live visuals from outside the court where Maduro and his wife are set to make their first appearance. They're facing 3 charges, including drug-related offenses. They were captured at their home over the weekend during a U.S. military operation. President Donald Trump, who ordered the operation to arrest the couple, has vowed that the U.S. will oversee Venezuela until a democratic transition takes place. Venezuela is home to the world's largest oil reserves, raising fears that political instability could drive global oil prices higher. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council is expected to hold an emergency meeting today on the U.S. operation against Venezuela. UN Secretary General António Guterres has called on all those involved in Venezuela to engage in inclusive dialogue in full respect of human rights and the rule of law. The UN says the meeting is supported by Colombia, a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, as well as Russia, a permanent member. At the same time, International Relations Minister Ronald Lamola has described the United States' attack on Venezuela as brazen and unlawful.
As the government of the Republic, we were taken aback by that posture of the U.S. because it is in violation of the UN Charter. It is in violation of the territorial integrity of Venezuela. And it's in violation of all principles that should govern respectability of sovereign states. So that's why we have issued the statement, and we have called for the sitting of the UN Security Council. And we're looking forward to the meeting this afternoon with the hope that progressive decisions will be taken and robust engagements will happen.
All right, we're now joined by reporter Zoleka Qodashe in studio, who's tracking that story very closely. Zoleka, thank you very much for your time. I mean, there's been a lot of conversation about the legality of this move. You would have heard the International Relations Minister, Ronald Lamola, says it's in violation of the UN Charter. Talk to us about that first.
Well, good afternoon, Linda, and good afternoon to the viewers. Well, it's an essential part of international law, and there has been talk about it being, the operation being a violation of international law, but I don't think it has been broken down the way that many people would understand. And essentially, international law rests on jurisdiction, right, and sovereignty. This is a basic tenet of international law. The failure to safeguard or rather to observe jurisdiction within particular states is a violation of international law. And so the UN Charter in particular speaks to Article 2.4 that prohibits the use of force, particularly within other states, right? And that's why they're saying that it's a violation of international law. But there is an utterance that, or utterances that were made by the United States President Donald Trump in relation to the running of Venezuela until there is a smooth transition of power, right? And Article 2.7 in that instance also prohibits the interference or intervention of another state in the affairs, the internal affairs of a different state. And so there are arguments that if the people of Venezuela are not happy with the current status quo in Venezuela, then it is up to those people, the citizens of that nation, to change it through democratic processes. But it is not for the United States to intervene, violating Article 2.7, but also violating Article 2.4 by the use of force.
Yeah, when we also look at the indictment, right, Zoleka, it also speaks about how Nicolas Maduro has always been a wanted person in the United States. The allegations of him, trafficking drugs into the U.S. But you rightfully point out the issue of jurisdiction. He's wanted in the U.S. So fetching him in his home country for crimes allegedly committed in the U.S. is, one would say, a breach of international law again.
That's correct. And the reason why there is that emergency Security Council meeting later today, we understand that it's going to be around 7 p.m. tonight, South African time, is precisely because of that breach, right, of international law. Now, in terms of international law, for such an invasion to take place or for such intervention to take place, it happens under two circumstances. One is when a state acts in self-defense, and two is if there has been the go-ahead, the thumbs up has been given by the Security Council. Now, both of those have not been met. That test has not been met. And so it is a violation of international law on those accounts. But you have 5 permanent member states within the Security Council, one of which is the United States, and which we do also know has vetoing power, right? So it remains to be seen what will come out of that particular emergency meeting, and how the United States will then also use its seat, its permanent seat within the Security Council in relation to a matter in which they are accused of violating international law. Linda.
Yeah, there's a lot of skepticism when it comes to what the UN Security Council will do, in light of, conversations about possible sanctions against the US.
That's correct. And you have France, you have China, you have Russia, you have the UK, and you have the United States in those as permanent members within the Security Council. But it's also important to note what has also taken place around also the non-permanent members within the Security Council. You have others that have condemned the action that has taken place. You have China, for example, that has also condemned the action of the United States, and also saying that, and this is a view that's held widely, that the United States has sort of adopted and really threw international law out the window, because the purpose of international law is to ensure that the sovereignty of each nation and jurisdiction is respected. And so you have a situation essentially where all of that has gone out of the window, and all we know about international law has essentially gone down the drain, Linda.
Let's talk about this first court appearance and what it's likely to look like.
I think also the question about the court appearance, remember, whenever extradition is also part of international law, right? And in fact, in South Africa, we've also had those chats or discussions around extradition and who has the power to extradite, right? In terms of the law, if someone commits an act that has an effect on the state in question, then there is a level of jurisdiction that they can apply, but it doesn't happen in the manner in which it has taken place with the United States, right? Where you have a sitting head of state that has essentially been abducted and taken to a different country to face charges. It doesn't happen in the manner in which we have seen in the United States with President Nicolas Maduro as well as his wife, right? It doesn't take place in that matter. There are extradition processes and also processes that would need to be fulfilled or met for someone of that nature to then face charges. But there's also claims of indemnity that sitting heads of states have in cases that, you will remember in instances with the International Criminal Court as well, right? The reason why states can only arrest a sitting head of state within their jurisdiction is because of that respect of international law. And so the manner in which this has taken place, of course, is something that requires a lot of scrutiny, I believe.
Yeah, given how the U.S. has sort of become on hold when it comes to this situation, a hold of it, in total control of what the moving parts, right? What legal recourse does Maduro have, if any, looking at the number of things that you've pointed out, issues of extradition, which we all know can be challenged, but given the circumstances involved, what legal recourse does he have?
I think the issue also is that you remember that one of the things that were mentioned, or some of the statements that were made by US President Donald Trump, is the fact that essentially anyone that tries to interfere with the operation of the United States will be met with the same kind of force, right? Which is also a violation of the UN Charter. And so when the Security Council meets today, I think a clear path or way forward will be charted out for all the member states, for permanent and non-permanent, and also in terms of the UN and how it operates and how it moves forward, it will be able to chart a way forward in terms of the operation and the invasion in Venezuela.
Zoleka Qodashe, our reporter, tracking that story very, very closely. She'll be giving us updates well into the evening. Thank you very much for your time. Now, to continue this conversation, we're joined by Professor Isaac Khambule, a professor of political economy at the University of Johannesburg. Professor, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. We noted the statement that were released by the interim president of Venezuela, seemingly talking about cooperation after, of course, slamming the actions of the U.S., calling it a kidnapping of their president. There's seemingly a change in tone. Let's talk about that first.
Well, thank you so much. And there's definitely seems to be a change in tone, and it is likely due to the manner in which Maduro was kidnapped or allegedly arrested by the U.S., of which, again, it showed its military might, of which, again, sends a picture that if you do not bow down to the needs of the U.S., then chances are we are also going to do the very same thing to you. So what we see currently is some sort of coercion that the U.S. is currently trying to utilize. But we also see, again, that there are several forces that are emerging saying that they are willing to defend Venezuela. And it should be quite interesting currently to see as to whether the change in tone of the acting president is going to reside with the popular masses, who seems to be, on the other hand, saying we want to do with these imperialistic tendencies of the U.S.
Yeah, and Zoleka and I were just talking about issues of sovereignty, and it seems the U.S. is going to be a hold of the situation until what it says is a just transition. But also, what impact does this conciliatory tone that the interim president have with the U.S. have on that particular transition, if it is indeed going to happen?
I think what we are seeing now is a case which is likely to throw the entire Venezuela into a mayhem, because, as indicated, there are certain forces that are not going to align with the reconciliatory terms that the current acting president is coming up with. And should it be the case, then it means that there are those who are going to look at her and say she has no authority over the country, and that the best thing to do is to come up with some popular uprisings that are going to overthrow her if she is indeed going to meet with the U.S. and try to align to their wishes. So I think what we are likely to see from all of this is two ways. So one, there could be a peaceful transition, as the U.S. has indicated, but then again, we know there's no such thing as a peaceful transition after a coup. Or two, what we're going to see then is an emergence of guerrilla wars that are going to happen between the U.S. and as well as counterpart organizations that are going to emerge within Venezuela, and with the support of other countries such as nearby, such as Cuba, as well as Colombia, because we know there has always been this popular uprising against the U.S. If you look at the history of Latin America, the majority of the revolutions that have occurred because the U.S. was trying to interfere in those particular countries. So it won't be a smooth sailing process as the Trump administration wishes it to be.
Yes, indeed. So let's now talk about, just the way forward, because we know that Donald Trump says they are taking back what has been stolen in relation to the oil, right? But some experts are warning that whatever that the U.S. is trying to do in terms of the infrastructure, because they are planning to rebuild the decaying infrastructure and take back the power in terms of oil, whatever that they're trying to do is going to take years and years. And Donald Trump, we know, is only here for a couple of years.
That we need to be clear on. The U.S. only cares about the oil, and it's just about the oil. They may say we're going to come up with infrastructure that Venezuela needs, we're going to rebuild the infrastructure that the Venezuelan economy needs in order to grow. But we know for a fact it is all about the oil. And once the U.S. gets its hands on the oil, they will not necessarily care about the people. I mean, they've been coming out saying, particularly if you look at Marco Rubio, he's been saying that they care about the U.S.'s national interest, but then at the same time, they also care about the people of Venezuela. But what has been clear is they care more about the national interest of the US rather than the Venezuelan people. And so what we are seeing now is just a case that the US will go in, take the oil, take as much as they can, privatize wherever they can. But at the end of the day, we know it is the poor people who are going to suffer the most. And it should be quite interesting again as to how those people are going to take it. Because as indicated, the history of Latin America has always shown a strong anti-American posture and as well as resistant to the imperialist tendencies that are often seen within the US.
Yeah, and he sent out a stern warning to the US's adversaries, as he calls them. And we've seen some of the countries are worried and wondering if they are next. Should countries, particularly like Colombia, and when you reference that with the indictment, should they be worried?
Definitely, I think Colombia should be worried, but what we're also witnessing is, there's a threat against Greenland, of which President Trump is busy saying we want it. It is a part of their core national interest. And again, we saw the president of Denmark, or the prime minister, coming out and saying Trump must stay away from issues in Greenland. And that again is going to push some country to start looking at the Trump administration in a manner that is going to send shockwaves, and at the same time then again start pushing an anti-Trump agenda, because as we are seeing, he's likely to disturb global order if indeed he goes through with challenging the likes of Cuba and as well as Colombia. And then the question becomes then, is he going to become the next Hitler who will want to overthrow particular countries that do not necessarily represent the interest of the US? Is this same thing that we are seeing also going to happen in countries such as South Africa, whereby there has been this idea or ideology that South Africa seems to be anti-US interest? It is mainly focusing on China and Iran. So what happens to those particular countries that have been termed as being not allies of the US? And that's where I think much of the betting is going to be.
Yeah, let's talk about the precedents now, because some analysts are saying that Trump is trying to replicate what the US did in Iraq.
Definitely. We saw it in Libya. We are seeing it now in Venezuela. But I think one of the core questions that we need to ask ourselves, if you look at some of the popular videos that are being shown, it shows that below there's this grassroots mobilization of the citizens. And should the US then say it wants to go to Venezuela and have its men on the ground? So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that we're going to have another Iraqi situation where a mass number of people are going to be killed for standing up against an interest in their country? Or does it necessarily mean that we are going to see new regimes that are going to be popping up? And these, I think, some of the greatest debates that are going to be happening. But from the side of it, we understand that the entire Latin America has not necessarily been the greatest friends to the US. And it should be quite interesting then as to whether the entire Latin American countries are going to mobilize against the US and try to, again, use the Venezuelan case study as means of saying this is how we can fight against the US. Or again, are they going to just sit down and allow the US to bully them in their own territory?
Let's talk about who stands to gain and who will lose most out of what is happening right now, given that Venezuela holds the world's largest proven oil reserves.
Great question. So I think the US here stands to be the greatest benefit of all of this, because we know they've been fighting against the much control of the Russian oil territory that has been going to India, that has been going to China. And now, should they be able then to amass the reserve in billions of the oil that is found in Venezuela, then it is likely to be that they will reduce their reliance on some of the OPEC countries, because we do know that the US is indeed calling shots within the OPEC, but now it will give them stronger and seismic power within the entire global oil trade. And again, of which also means that it is going to control that particular arm. And in so controlling,
Khambule, I'm going to have to come in there. Unfortunately, the president is addressing media in the northwest